South Africa. The very name brings to mind one extraordinary figure, a tall, dark-skinned man with graying curly hair, the great Nelson Mandela. Mandela dedicated his entire life to fighting for the rights and freedom of South Africa's black population. Despite committing no crime, he spent 27 years behind bars. His only offense was standing up for the oppressed and giving a voice to those who had been silenced. Nelson Mandela's life is filled with remarkable moments of courage, sacrifice, and determination. From a young age, he stood firmly against injustice. As a student, he began protesting the brutal system of racial oppression imposed by the white minority. In the beginning, he believed in peaceful resistance, drawing inspiration from another legendary leader from India, Mahatma Gandhi. However, history would eventually force him to abandon strict nonviolence. As oppression intensified, Mandela concluded that peaceful protests alone could no longer bring freedom to his people. That decision would change his life forever, leading to decades of imprisonment under harsh conditions. During those years, he endured grueling labor, spending much of his prison life working in a limestone quarry. Time and again, he was offered freedom, wealth, and privileges in exchange for abandoning the struggle. But Mandela rejected every offer. Rather than betray his people, he chose the hardships of prison over a life of comfort. He never compromised his principles, and he never turned his back on the millions who looked to him for hope. In today's documentary, we'll explore the extraordinary life of Nelson Mandela, the man who transformed South Africa and became one of the greatest symbols of freedom in modern history. July 18th, 1918. In the Cape Province of South Africa, a boy was born into the royal Thembu family. His birth name was Rolihlahla Dalibunga Mandela. Years later, while attending a missionary school, one of his teachers gave him the English name the world would come to know, Nelson. Mandela's father had 4 wives, and his mother, Nosekeni Fanny, was the third. His father served as the chief of a local village. However, after a dispute with a white magistrate, he was stripped of his position in 1926. Forced to leave his village, he moved to a neighboring community, where he lived a humble life like any ordinary citizen. Despite these hardships, Mandela's childhood remained largely unaffected. At the appropriate age, he was enrolled in a local missionary school, where the foundation of his education, and the journey that would eventually change the course of history, first began. 1930. After a prolonged illness, Nelson Mandela's father passed away. Following his father's death, Mandela was sent to live under the care of the Thembu regent, Jongintaba Dalindebo, who became his legal guardian. Mandela was raised with love and discipline in the regent's household. Jongintaba and his wife treated him as one of their own children, while their son, Justice, grew up as Mandela's closest friend, more like a brother than a companion. At the age of 16, Mandela underwent the traditional Thembu initiation ceremony, marking his transition into manhood. It was a defining moment in his early life, symbolizing both responsibility and adulthood. After completing his early education, Mandela enrolled at the prestigious University of Fort Hare, where he studied in the Faculty of Arts. During this time, Regent Jongintaba arranged a marriage for him. But there was one major problem. The young woman chosen to be Mandela's bride was the woman Justice was deeply in love with. Neither Mandela nor Justice had the courage to confront their guardian and reveal the truth. At the same time, Mandela became involved in student politics. By the end of 1940, political activism at the university had created serious tensions in his life. Caught between an arranged marriage and growing political conflict, Mandela made a life-changing decision. Together with Justice, he fled to Johannesburg, where they found work as security guards at a gold mine. But their escape was short-lived. Once Jongintaba learned of their whereabouts, the 2 young men were forced to flee again to avoid the arranged marriage. Their next destination was Alexandra, a township that would become the beginning of a completely new chapter in Nelson Mandela's extraordinary journey. A short time later, Jongintaba Dalindebo forgave both Mandela and Justice, inviting them to return home. But fate had other plans. In 1942, Jongintaba passed away. Mandela and Justice returned to attend his funeral, and Justice succeeded his father as regent of the Thembu people. Although Mandela was expected to serve as a privy councillor of Thembuland, he chose a different path. Instead of accepting a traditional leadership role, he returned to Johannesburg, determined to pursue higher education and a greater purpose. In 1943, Mandela completed his bachelor's degree and began preparing for postgraduate studies. He enrolled at the University of the Witwatersrand, where he studied law. At the university, Mandela was the only black African student in his class. As a result, he faced racial discrimination on a regular basis. Yet those difficult experiences only strengthened his resolve. During this time, Mandela formed close friendships with European communists, Indian students, and Jewish classmates, people who had also experienced prejudice and discrimination in different ways. Their shared struggles and ideas broadened his perspective and further fueled his determination to fight against injustice. It was here that Nelson Mandela's political consciousness truly began to take shape, laying the foundation for the lifelong struggle that would eventually change South Africa forever. As time went on, Nelson Mandela became increasingly involved in political activism. By the end of 1943, he had developed close relationships with several leading figures of the African National Congress, ANC. Among them, Walter Sisulu became one of the greatest influences on Mandela's political journey. Together with Oliver Tambo and other young activists, Mandela helped establish the ANC Youth League, a movement dedicated to energizing the struggle against racial oppression and inspiring a new generation of leaders. Then, in 1948, South Africa experienced a dramatic political shift. The National Party, a government committed to white supremacy, came to power. Almost immediately, it introduced a series of apartheid laws, a system of legalized racial segregation designed to separate black and white citizens in every aspect of life. Under apartheid, black South Africans were stripped of basic civil rights. They were denied equal access to education, employment, healthcare, housing, and even the freedom to live or travel where they wished. The discrimination was so severe that it often seemed as though black people were not citizens of their own country. The tragic irony was impossible to ignore. The black population was the indigenous majority of South Africa, yet they were treated as strangers in the very land their ancestors had called home for generations. In 1950, Nelson Mandela was appointed as a leader of the ANC Youth League, marking the beginning of his rise as one of South Africa's most prominent anti-apartheid activists. He intensified the campaign against the ruling National Party, organizing protests and acts of civil resistance across the country. At this stage, however, Mandela remained firmly committed to nonviolent resistance. Inspired by the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, he believed that peaceful protest was the most powerful weapon against injustice. But the apartheid government was determined to crush the movement at any cost. In 1956, Mandela and 155 other anti-apartheid activists were arrested and charged with treason. The government hoped the trial would silence the resistance once and for all. Instead, after nearly 5 years of legal proceedings, every defendant was found not guilty. Despite this victory, Mandela had become convinced that peaceful resistance alone could no longer defeat the brutality of apartheid. As the government's violence escalated, so did his determination to fight back. In 1961, Mandela helped establish Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, meaning Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the African National Congress. Serving as one of its founding leaders, Mandela embraced a new strategy of sabotage against government infrastructure, arguing that armed resistance had become a last resort after every peaceful avenue had been exhausted. Mandela had no previous military experience when he took on the responsibility of leading an armed resistance movement. Determined to prepare himself, he traveled across several African countries, including Morocco and Ethiopia, where he received training in guerrilla warfare and military strategy before returning to South Africa. Once back home, Mandela intensified the operations of Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK. The campaign focused primarily on acts of sabotage against government facilities and infrastructure. However, as the conflict escalated, some operations also resulted in the deaths of civilians. Mandela later acknowledged the tragic consequences of the armed struggle. Yet he argued that, after years of peaceful protests had been met with brutal repression, his movement believed it had no other choice but to resist by force. To this day, some critics continue to condemn the actions of MK. But many historians argue that those events cannot be understood without recognizing the brutal reality of apartheid. The apartheid regime enforced one of the most oppressive systems of racial discrimination in modern history. Although black South Africans made up nearly 70% of the population, they were confined to just 13 to 15% of the country's land. The white minority controlled the vast majority of the nation's wealth, resources, and political power. In their own homeland, millions of black South Africans were treated as second-class citizens, stripped of their rights, denied basic freedoms, and subjected to systematic discrimination for decades. The areas designated for black South Africans were known as Bantustans, or so-called homelands. Under apartheid law, strict restrictions controlled where black people could live, work, and travel. Entering many white designated areas required special permits, and interracial marriages were outlawed. Basic civil rights were virtually non-existent. In their own country, millions of black South Africans were treated like foreigners, excluded from opportunities, denied equality, and deprived of the freedoms that every citizen should enjoy. Meanwhile, the growing activities of Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, placed increasing pressure on the apartheid government. Determined to crush the resistance, authorities launched an intensive manhunt for Nelson Mandela. In 1962, Mandela was finally arrested. His arrest sparked outrage across South Africa. Thousands of oppressed citizens took to the streets in protest, and repeated clashes broke out between demonstrators and police. At the same time, MK continued its campaign against the apartheid regime, further escalating tensions. The government placed the blame squarely on Mandela. He was prosecuted in a series of highly controversial trials, which many viewed as politically motivated. Finally, in 1964, Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment, marking the beginning of what would become 27 years behind bars, a punishment that would transform him from a resistance leader into a global symbol of freedom and justice. Rather than keeping Nelson Mandela on the South African mainland, The apartheid government transferred him to the isolated Robben Island prison, hoping to cut him off from the outside world. Life on Robben Island was brutal. Mandela spent countless hours performing hard labor in a limestone quarry, enduring harsh conditions under the relentless African sun. But prison failed to break his spirit. Instead, it strengthened his legacy. While locked behind bars, Mandela's name spread across the globe. He became an international symbol of resistance, justice, and the fight for freedom. Around the world, millions came to see him as the uncompromising voice of the oppressed. Mandela spent the first 18 years of his imprisonment on Robben Island before being transferred to Pollsmoor prison. Throughout his years in captivity, the apartheid government repeatedly sought ways to silence him. According to many historical accounts, there were persistent concerns about threats to his life, but Mandela refused to be intimidated or manipulated. After his transfer to Pollsmoor, government officials began holding secret negotiations with him. They offered promises of freedom, comfort, and a privileged life, on one condition, that he persuade Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, to end its armed struggle. Mandela refused every offer. For him, personal freedom meant nothing if millions of South Africans remained trapped under the chains of apartheid. He would not trade his principles for comfort, nor abandon the people whose freedom he had spent his life fighting to achieve. The apartheid government even proposed a political settlement, hoping Mandela would compromise. But his response was unwavering. Only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts. Mandela insisted that meaningful negotiations could begin only after he was unconditionally released. Although he remained behind bars, his ideals could not be imprisoned. The anti-apartheid movement continued to grow, drawing increasing support from ordinary South Africans. As public resistance intensified, the apartheid government responded with even greater force. Security forces repeatedly opened fire on peaceful demonstrations, leaving many civilians dead or injured. The escalating violence soon attracted worldwide attention. International pressure mounted as the United Nations and many governments imposed sanctions and demanded an end to apartheid. South Africa found itself increasingly isolated on the global stage, while calls for Mandela's release grew louder than ever. Then came a turning point. In 1989, South African President P.W. Botha resigned after suffering a stroke. He was succeeded by F.W. de Klerk, a leader who recognized that apartheid had become politically, economically, and morally unsustainable. His arrival marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would ultimately reshape the future of South Africa. Unlike many of his predecessors, President F.W. de Klerk recognized that South Africa could no longer survive under apartheid. Soon after taking office, he lifted the bans on several black political organizations, including the African National Congress, ANC, and began dismantling the foundations of the apartheid system. Then came the moment the world had been waiting for. On February 11, 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela walked free. His release was celebrated across South Africa and around the world. But instead of calling for revenge, Mandela delivered a message of reconciliation. He urged his supporters to maintain peace and avoid hatred toward white South Africans, while making it clear that the struggle against apartheid would continue until true equality and democracy were achieved. In 1992, President de Klerk held a whites-only referendum to determine whether negotiations to end apartheid should continue. Nearly 69% of white voters supported the reform process, giving the government a clear mandate to move forward with dismantling the apartheid system. Following his release, Mandela was elected president of the African National Congress. He then entered historic negotiations with President de Klerk, talks that would eventually bring an end to decades of racial segregation and lay the foundation for a democratic South Africa. The negotiations moved forward without descending into widespread racial conflict, paving the way for a peaceful transition. In recognition of their extraordinary efforts to end apartheid through dialogue, Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk were jointly awarded the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize. Over the course of his life, Mandela would receive countless other international honors for his unwavering commitment to justice, equality, and human rights. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election, allowing citizens of all races to vote for the first time in the nation's history. The African National Congress, ANC, won by a landslide, and Nelson Mandela was elected as South Africa's first black president. Many white South Africans feared that Mandela would seek revenge for decades of oppression, but once again, he surprised the world. Instead of retaliation, Mandela chose reconciliation. Rather than dividing the nation, he called on South Africans of every race to build a new future together. His leadership proved that his lifelong struggle had never been about replacing one form of oppression with another. It had always been about restoring freedom, equality, and dignity to those who had been denied it for generations. On December 5th, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. Yet his legacy lives on. More than a South African leader, Mandela became a global symbol of courage, forgiveness, and hope. A man whose unwavering belief in justice inspired millions far beyond the borders of Africa. His story remains a timeless reminder that true leadership is not measured by power, but by the courage to stand for what is right, even in the face of unimaginable